Delighted to be here in Bermuda. Welcome back to Coral Live. We're here at Trunk Island, the nature reserve. And I'm very, very happy to be with Dr. Robbie Smith, curator of the Natural History Museum. And as you were just saying, Bermuda's senior marine scientist.
Well, I've been around for a while, so I get to say that because I'm older than all the other scientists we have here, many of which are former students and interns of mine. So it's a great pleasure to be here on Coral Live and a chance to engage with your audience, talk a little bit about coral reefs that are unusual in different ways, how distinct Bermuda's reefs are, and happy to answer any questions and have some good discussion this afternoon.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very, very much. One of the things we're going to do is we'll probably start off with a little bit of show and tell, just to sort of learn a little bit more about the marine environment here. As you were saying, we're not on the reef proper. We're sort of hanging off a jetty in a sound. So how does where we are at the moment, the sort of more calmer inland water, connect to the reef?
Sure. Bermuda's reef system is very large, and the reefs that are really vibrant and full of life are further offshore, either off to the south or off to our north. That's where the reef is developed. But these inshore areas, these protected sites like Trunk Island, are very important because this is a place, what we call a nursery habitat. Many fish species are in here as juvenile fishes. As they grow and get larger, they're going to migrate out to the reef. So there's a connectedness between our protected inshore areas and the vibrancy, the health of our offshore reefs. So that's why it's important to be here, because we can't always be out at sea, and it's difficult to do transmissions like that from that in Bermuda. But that's the importance of this place. It's calm. It has a lot of food resources, very important for juvenile fishes to hang out in seagrass beds, lobsters and other species that come into these waters. And just down here, I'm sure I could find a few small lobsters. I can't promise it, but they're probably in here. So that's the importance of this particular body of water that we're physically standing in right now.
Brilliant. And there are, we've seen down amongst our feet sort of a lot of sort of examples of what you'd find on a typical reef habitat anyway, even if they're sort of a bit sort of fewer and far between. So we've got and we're going to take the camera underwater in this sort of part two of this. Good. But we've got a couple of grazers and sort of what one might call the tritivores down here.
Yeah, so it's two of the animals that are common here, but are still evident, maybe not the same species, but doing the same function are common here. And one of them is our short-spined sea urchin, Litocynus, and it's a grazer. It's a echinoderm, got lots of spines, and sort of crawls across the bottom, just feeding on plant life. And there's many different grazers out on our coral reefs, of which parrotfishes, which are also evident here, are very important. We also have something called the sea cucumber, related to the echinoderms. It's in the echinoderm group as well. We call them sea puddings, and they just basically take in sand, get nutrient material out of that sand, and then eliminate the end. And that's a really important process for bringing nutrients back into the water that benefits the plants that are all around us. Everything starts with plants growing, living and dying, either being consumed directly, that's what the urchin does, or when they die off, becomes a pool of material we call detritus, and that's the food for many different animals, including these sea puddings. So shall we go have a look at some of these?
I think so.
I guess I have to get wet. Let me pop down and have a quick peek.
And Robbie's just going to go and see what we can find down here. We've got very hello to Mr. Chris's second grade, and I think there might be a sea pudding. Is that right?
Yep, we have the sea pudding here. It's not a very exciting animal. It doesn't look like a whole lot. Very long, really cylindrical. It's got a mouth at one end and an anus at the other end, and it just sits on the bottom, so it slowly pulls it along. It's got some very simple type of feet. Can't really see them. Just gulping in the food, just goes through all the digestive tract and out the other end. That's its life. Very simple.
And related to a starfish.
But you wouldn't believe it. But these animals are highly threatened because in Southeast Asia, they're turned into a food called trepang. They're also known as bêche de mer. And so they've been totally fished out in the Pacific, and they've been heavily exploited in the Caribbean. And now in Bermuda, they're a protected species. People just didn't appreciate their value. Ooh, what's that? And who can imagine even eating this? But it's a delicacy, and delicacy commands a fair bit of money. So you can imagine about 200 of these worth about $400 US. And that's what drives over exploitation.
About $2.
We're just going to take care of our sea cucumbers here.
And it's interesting, on working in East Timor, they used the sea cucumber as an indicator of overfishing.
Yep.
So
yep.
it was,
if you don't have any sea cucumbers, somebody's taking them, because as an animal, this is not something you want to eat. I'm not going to eat it. Fish aren't going to eat this. So they're pretty protective, and so their population can be pretty stable over time. When we come in and harvest them for what humans have learned to do with them, then we can see them disappearing pretty quickly. Let me put this guy back and see if I can find us a sea urchin. Don't swim very well, but I'm sure he'll be fine on the bottom.
Brilliant. So there we have the sea cucumber, relation of the starfish. And now coming up, an incredibly important animal, the sea urchin. And I'm sure Robbie will tell us sort of what happens if these guys weren't around, as well as explaining to us sort of a little bit about them.
So I said that the role of that fairly simple animal is just to process organic material, the stuff that's left over after all life's work through things, to put the nutrients that are back into the water that plants need to get at. Plants can't grow without nutrients, whether it's you're a farmer in a field or you're taking care of your house plants or in your garden, they need nutrients. And so those animals, the sea cucumbers, are really important for bringing those nutrients back in the water to keep the growth of the plants up, and everybody benefits from that process. So here's one of the sea urchins, and you can see it's very spiny, and that's its defense from fishes in particular. Fishes have a hard time trying to get at this. If I turned it over like this, you can see the underside. There's sort of a mouth in there. It's got a set of jaws that just sort of slowly scrapes along the rocks, picking up stuff. It can eat seagrass if it gets a hold of it. You can't see it very well, but it has thousands of little tiny, what we call tube feet, that it used to hold on to things. And in a very simple way, they all grab something. They're grabbing my hand right now, and well, it's not that strong, but that's how it gets around. And the tube feet are really important. And what it's doing is actually using the 2 feet to hold these little pieces of a leaf right here. That's basically decorations. And they do that, particularly in shallow water, as a way of shading themselves. They're a dark body, and dark bodies absorb the sunlight a lot more, and they warm up. And that's a beneficial thing sometimes, but sometimes it costs them a lot of energy. So by being shaded, the animal has a way of sort of regulating its body temperature. We do that differently. These invertebrates are cold-blooded animals that can't do that. So by shading themselves with these bits and pieces of stuff, it keeps itself kind of cool. All right.
Brilliant. And in the Caribbean, they've not so many sea urchins anymore.
Well, in 1983, I was around to watch this. All these first cousins of this one, not this particular species, died out, and they had played a really important role on the outer reefs of grazing the algae down. And losing these grazers, as well at that time in the Caribbean, most of the grazing fishes had been eaten. There was nothing to control the fast-growing algae, and it completely smothered the reefs in many parts of the Caribbean that we've been studying. So these group of animals are really important to the health of reefs, and we've had a very slow recovery of these long-spine sea urchins on the outer reefs throughout the Caribbean. We have seen some progress in terms of restoring the fish populations, particularly parrotfishes, and Bermuda was really distinctive in doing so early in the 90s, and we have very healthy populations today that help regulate the growth of these fast-growing plants. They compete for space with corals. Plants can grow a lot faster than corals, and so it can become a blanket that can smother a leaf pretty quickly without grazers like these, as well as parrotfishes, which I won't be able to catch for you right now.
No?
I'm going to put this guy back in the water. Doesn't mind being out of the water for a little while, but they all like to be where they belong. All right. Get my hat back on here before I get sunburned. All right, Jamie, what are we going to talk about next?
Well, I was just going to, there's a few questions coming to from Mr.
Great.
Chris's second grade class. And we're straight into a little bit of coral bleaching.
Oh, sounds good.
But should we get a lot of questions about sort of the problems that reef is facing. I think that's in the news a lot at the moment. But can we just have a look at coral and understanding, sort of through seeing some dead coral, or what bleaching?
Yeah. So this is a piece of what we call greater star coral, and it's a kind of very distinctive group of polyps. They make up the colony that we call a coral. There's a different type of coral, the ivory bush coral, and the polyps are a little bit smaller here. But they're bone white. That's their natural skeleton that lies underneath a veneer, thin layer of tissue that's on the surface of the coral that every day lays down new skeleton, basically grows away in this direction. So it would be growing towards you. Now, corals have natural color in the water, which we can't see here very easily, and they can be greens and browns, sort of general spectrum of color that's associated with plants. Because what corals have is a huge population of single-celled plants called zooxanthellae that live in their tissues. And the coral greatly benefits from having those zooxanthellae in those tissues. They photosynthesize, give some energy to the coral. They take some of the coral waste and use it for their growth. That's a really great symbiosis, how these two organisms, quite different, work together for their benefit. The coral can grow quickly and the algae gets a place to live. However, what we've learned over the last nearly 30 years is that when corals get stressed, particularly by above normal water temperatures, this relationship breaks down. They just aren't getting along very well, and the coral doesn't really feel the benefits are worth whatever cost it's paying to have those algae. So it expels all these single-cell algae, just sort of spits them out. And what you look at then when that's happened, and that's what we call coral bleaching, you go from a natural color, this one here is generally a sort of a chocolate brown, and you just see the skeleton shining through there because there's no intervening layer of these algae there to do the work that the coral had benefited from. So coral bleaching is a problem that we've seen getting progressively worse. We're having had 2 terrible years in the Caribbean and also the Great Barrier Reef. In Bermuda, we get some coral bleaching, but it doesn't really have a long-term effect. And so we've been benefiting from the fact that we're at a slightly higher latitude. At this time of year, I'm standing in water. It's about 25 degrees C, about 74, 75 degrees Fahrenheit. That's pretty warm. And but it was quite a bit hotter in the summer. But that length of warm water in the summer is relatively short here compared to what you see in the Caribbean in more tropical waters. That long period of hot water is what really can cause the stress to corals and result in the coral bleaching.
So when we talk about coral bleaching, we don't mean that the coral's dying, but it can lead to coral dying.
So the coral says, okay, I don't like this relationship with my algae, so I'm going to get rid of them. And the coral can happily sit there for a while. It has other ways of getting energy. They have, as you probably know, tentacles that generally come out at night, and they can feed on plankton and other things in the water, and that's enough energy input to keep the coral ticking along. But if the stress keeps going, and particularly it's a heat stress, and it's something similar to what I mentioned to before about the sea urchin needing shading, is when you warm these animals up, they burn a lot of energy. And if it stays warm too long, they run up and use up all their energy. You know how you feel after a long day without any food. Well, you just don't feel like you can do very much. And so for corals to have this persistent drain of energy means that they're not able to grow. And at some point that produces the death of the coral.
And once you've had that coral death from bleaching, can that reef recover?
Well, this is just basically a piece of rock. And all reefs that we see today and around Bermuda, they've been growing for about 5,000 years or so. A coral grows for a while and then dies of some different causes. Could be a hurricane, could have been bleaching in the past. But that basic rock becomes a place where new life can attach to. So larvae of other corals or fast-growing algae can attach to that surface and begin to grow again. So that there's a cycle of life and death on reef, which is completely natural. We just are worried that we're accelerating the death of these corals, and that we've also know that when corals get bleached and they don't die, they don't actually reproduce the next year. So that slows down that recovery process. And year after bleaching, which has been the case in the Great Barrier Reef, has really shut off this natural replenishment cycle.
One, punch after another punch, and
so we need to have these coral skeletons. The worst thing we can think of is how our ocean's becoming acidified, and we're worried that these skeletons may be there, but they might start dissolving if our ocean gets more and more acidic.
Wow.
And that's we still have to understand that. We can show it experimentally. It's very easy to dissolve one of these things in acid, but is that going to be the character of the ocean's waters in 20 or 50 or 100 years time? We don't know, but it certainly would be a problem. So as long as the coral skeletons are there, there's a place to see a replenishment. Coral reefs get beat up all the time. Hurricanes destroy all sorts of stuff, but they grow back. That's why they persisted for tens of millions of years in many parts of the world.
Thank you very much. There's a question which I'm going to slightly rephrase. What have you been most surprised by in your work as a scientist?
I am always surprised by discovering things. I mean, I spent all my life working in Bermuda. I still go into the water with the sense like I might find something I haven't seen before. It might be a fish I haven't seen. It might be a coral with a different pigmentation. It might even be a different coral. And I think that's, to me, is always a great pleasure of coming to work, because I don't quite know what I'm going to find. And so that's really the best thing, is that opportunity for discovery. That's really what I think is the greatest part about this work I do.
And what do scientists like to do when they're not working?
I like to play music. I like to play music. I like running. Scientists like to talk to other scientists. When we're not working, we like to hang out with other scientists because we share a lot in common. And we might not always talk about science, but we have a common point of view about how the world works, and we like to spend time together. We just bring normal people, but some of us just have to stand around in a wetsuit for a long period of time.
That this question sort of, we're talking about the corals in Bermuda and some of them being more resilient than others, and the question coming through saying, can you sort of crossbreed corals, as it were, just to try and get?
So when you talk about something like coral bleaching, and you could have 100 corals, you could have 100 of our brain corals. This is a very most common coral we have in Bermuda, and in the surveys I've done of bleaching, or I've done with my students in the past, we can go out and see 100 brain corals, and maybe 5 of them are bleached, and the rest look fine, and except for 2 or 3 that look a little, less than normal. So in any population, there's always variation because they're all genetically different. I'm different than Jamie. We're both human males, but we have a different genome. So this coral's response to a stress might be catastrophic, but the one next to it has just enough variation in the genome that at a physiological level, how it's growing, how it's responding to the water temperature and the heat stress, means it's fine. And that's what nature always benefits from, is that the variation we create in reproducing new organisms means that there's always somebody who's probably going to have an advantage. It's going to be carried forward in time, because that's the one, that group of animals that didn't get bleached are the ones that are going to survive. So I think that sort of gives the idea that we count on having variation in organisms. That's what natural selection is taking advantage of things that can persist through an unpredictable change.
And then would we? I mean, is there any sort of work being doing on GM coral?
Oh, so yeah, I got a little distracted. So when you know, and you go out in the field and say, well, that coral's bleached and that coral's bleached, but that one isn't. Some scientists have been grabbing those corals and bringing them into the laboratory and saying, well, let's look more closely at the genome, and let's just play around with trying to breed that particular coral, and then get those corals that they produce in the lab and see how they respond to stress. So there is some idea of selectively targeting animals that seem to have survived coral bleaching and seeing if we can propagate them. And so we've had a little bit of luck in there. We can't really manipulate the genome directly, but we're taking advantage of the variation that exists there and trying to propagate the ones that have seemed to be the most resilient, most able to tolerate these sort of short-term changes in environmental conditions.
Brilliant. Joanne from Texas would like to know more about your work the work you've done on lionfish.
Done quite a bit on lionfish, in that Bermuda is distinctive in having had lionfish for longer than anybody else in the Caribbean. After they were first discovered off the coast of Florida, then Georgia, then North Carolina, it was Bermuda. We had them here in 2000. So about 4 years ago, we decided we needed to know a lot more about our lionfish. So we spent a lot more time surveying both shallow and deep reefs, all the way down to 50 meters, and just seeing where are they. And they weren't everywhere. In fact, most of our sites didn't have lionfish. But we did find some patterns of lionfish are very specific in where they want to be at different times of the year. So in the summertime, we found all lionfish go to fairly deep water, down about 50 meters, about 200 feet, and hang out there. They're sometimes in great numbers, like 40, 50, all in an area just sort of the size of this bay right here. So they're aggregating there. That might be for just hanging out together, but probably for reproduction. But we don't know for sure. So we know more about where they are. We found, luckily, that they aren't in very many places. And we looked very hard for a very long period of time. And we have other people who have been working on knowing where they are, because we have a program where we train people, license people to go out with scuba tanks and spears to try and catch them. And most people are in shallow water most of the time because that's easier to get to. And also an awful lot of spear fishermen are doing that. So we still don't find very many lionfish all across our system, which is completely different than the case of the Caribbean, where they're just in absolutely every area. You could be in shallow water like this and there should be lionfish. We didn't find any lionfish in shallow water. So we've also looked at what they eat. And in the Caribbean, they seem to eat a lot of small fish. And here we discovered, after dissecting, well, I say we, but it's our grad student, Corietti, dissected well over 1,000 lionfish. And most of them, about 50% of the diet, were crustaceans, crabs, shrimps, and octopus. Only 50% or less were actually fishes. So Bermuda, the fish are doing something different in terms of where they live and what they're eating, compared to what we know for the really incredible catastrophe in the Caribbean. I know in the Gulf of Mexico, they do have a lot of concerns about some of the offshore reefs that you have off the coast of Texas.
And the impact they're having on Bermuda's reef?
Well, they're certainly eating something, and we're doing our best to eat the lionfish. And so at this point, they're so broadly spread and in waters that we're not possibly going to get to. And last summer, in some sub dives that Catlin's supported the necktie mission, we found one down at about 200 meters. So it's like 600 feet down. So we're not going to fish them out from down there. So the impact is really that they're going to eat something. But the other side of the equation is that we eat all sorts of fishes like lionfish. We eat our groupers and our snappers. So we're taking out predators. Now we got another predator that's come in, sort of replacing that. So the overall impact isn't necessarily catastrophic unless the lionfish population grows beyond what historical levels of predatory fishes like snapper groupers might be. So we still have to be concerned about it, and we still put a lot of effort into try to catch them, eat them, because they taste quite well in many different ways, like great sushi, a good piece of grilled fish as well. So that's our approach, is to know where they are, to try to target them and get as many as we can, just to try to keep a lid on their population. If it becomes explosive, as we've seen in the Caribbean, then I think we have a lot more concern.
Great.
So far, so good.
Something came out in one of our chats this morning with one of the schools. Found a paper suggesting that coral polyps preferred plastic when it was introduced.
Oh, I saw the paper.
Yeah. So there's that. I don't know what chemical signals or sort of. I haven't read the paper. Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? And then what does that tell us about the impact of plastics on the coral animal?
It's sad to say you can't not think about plastic in the ocean. I spend a lot of time looking for plastic in the offshore waters in terms of what we find in our open ocean. But it's all around us in Bermuda. I could go to the shoreline and pick up most of the plastic. But the plastic we're concerned about is stuff that you can't see. It's plastic that's been in the ocean for maybe several decades and broken down, so it's less than a millimeter in size. And at that size, more and more different things can consume plastic. And corals, as I talked about before, have a simple polyp that can pick things out of the water. And in this study, which was done in the laboratory, a student at Duke University in the U.S. found that new plastic was consumed by the corals pretty well. But plastic had been sitting around in the water for a while, which actually had biology growing on it, bacteria, a little bit of algae, wasn't preferred. So the odds of plastic staying fresh for very long in the ocean is pretty limited. It was an interesting study. The more surprising thing was I wrote to the scientist, whose name was Austin Allen. I said, hey, I'd like to get your paper. Turned out he works in Bermuda, but he works on dolphins.
Okay.
And so we have a wild dolphin project. He's a grad student in Duke, and now we had a long conversation about studying Bermuda's dolphins. They're going to be affected by plastic. They're predators. They eat fish that are probably eating plastic, and I have more I could talk about that. But it's interesting that plastic in the ocean, there's lots of different animals that can consume plastic. Let me show you one of them. Here's a sponge. Sponges are filter feeders. They're pulling in water, pulling out what they want to consume, mostly organic matter, but they'll also pull in a fair bit of plastic. It'll be stuck in here. Will it affect that sponge? Maybe not. But lots of different animals make a living consuming particles in the water, mostly after plankton, small mobile organisms, things like copepods, ciliates. But plastic's there, and it's there in very small sizes, and more animals are going to consume that.
So when a coral polyp ingests, eats a little bit of plastic, a microplastic, as they're called, what damage can that cause the coral animal?
I'm sure the corals have been making mistakes about eating things for their entire history of their evolution history. It'll probably just spit it back out. The thing we're worried about plastic, when it's floating on the surface of the water right here, it can't sink because it's buoyant, and it's also what we call hydrophobic. Doesn't want to be dissolved in water. We have a sheen of chemicals on the surface of the ocean, leftover pesticides, herbicides that have washed off land into the water. And the plastic sits there like a little sponge and soaks up those chemicals. When those chemicals go into somebody's digestive system, it changes the chemistry of that plastic, and those chemicals come out into the animal's digestive system. Probably not going to affect the coral. But I am greatly concerned, and many people are concerned about what happens when the plastic makes its way into fish and into fish digestive systems. So those fish begin to accumulate those chemicals. So the plastic's inert, but it's what it's carrying with it that becomes a potential threat to our marine life.
So then in the Arctic, people have been talking about endocrine disruptors, and that building up through the food chain and having an impact on polar bear fertility.
Yeah.
Are we seeing, are people finding similar chemical issues in marine life?
We haven't really looked closely enough in a lot of different places. So this summer, I had a student working on our bait fish. We have a whole school of bait fish right over here, and these are small little silvery fishes that really wants to eat. And I know Jamie was having a difficult time this morning because there were so many predators coming in after these bait fishes. But the bait fishes, 20% of them had plastic in them. And we looked at another group of fishes that eat the bait fishes, and 20% of them had plastic. So that's our food chain, and that's where our concern about plastic is coming from. So the reef is generally, just surrounded by oceanic water, particularly here in the Sargasso Sea, which we know is an area of very concentrated plastics, both big plastic and microplastics. So all the filter feeders on the reef are going to be exposed to that plastic. I mean, the plastic floats on the surface, that helps. And when the wind blows, the plastic gets pushed below the surface for a while, and that's when it can be potentially taken up before it pops back to the surface. So, it's a very subtle and very subtle impact that I think we really just only recently discovered is probably pretty significant. We have to figure out ways to change what we do with plastic to keep it out of our waters.
Well, a lot of people were talking about some of this sort of more downstream solutions in the talks of sort of how filtering it out, doing this, sieves, sea bins, that kind of thing. Whereas really, it's changing our habits.
It is, and we're responsible for the waste. I mean, Bermuda, as I said, it sits in an area full of plastic, but it's plastic that's come from North America, West Africa, Europe, South America. Not our plastic. We manage our waste pretty well. We're not perfect, of course, but just this accumulation over time is just an astounding amount of plastic in the ocean. It's not going anywhere. So we have to cut it off at its source and hope that natural processes like bacteria that can break down plastic, which there seem to be some now that we've studied a bit more carefully, will help it disappear. We don't want to see it all disappear in the food webs.
Are there some sea creatures that can break down plastics as well?
I'm not aware of that. I think your basic animal digestive system is just going to let it go all the way through. So that sea pudding I picked up before, there might be some plastic in the sediments, and I actually had a group from Spain and Brussels here this summer. We picked up some, we dissected some. They were curious to see what's in there. Plastic can get heavier and leave the surface and end up in the bottom, and then it would go into the animal. That animal's a bit of a dead end, literally, because nobody wants to eat it. But the plastic, both in the deep ocean and in shallow water, can get from the surface into the sediments and therefore into food webs again.
Okay, if we go big again in terms of subject, how many types of coral are there, and why are they so fascinating?
Well, there's different parts of the world that have different levels of coral diversity. So in the Pacific, it's 700 plus species. They keep finding new ways to decide that there are more species than they used to think, based on simple morphology. Now we have molecular tools that tell us a bit more about diversity. In the Caribbean, there's about 75 shallow water corals. In Bermuda, we have 21 shallow water corals. Our position here and the relatively cold water seems to have prevented some Caribbean corals of being successful in colonizing there. So we have, in general, in Bermuda, fewer species of corals and many other different animals than we find in the Caribbean. Just because of our position, we're kind of far away from the Caribbean, and that might make it difficult for larvae to get there to here. So that accounts for some of the differences.
Great. And why are they so fascinating? This is from East Hampton.
Well, I think it's fascinating because we can look at Bermuda's reefs, we can look at other reefs and know that they've been around for thousands to hundreds of thousands to millions of years. They're a very successful piece of biology. Forests come and go, but reefs really have persisted for a long time. And because these corals that sort of pile up and build the reef over time are such a resistant structure, people would say, yes, you can see the Great Barrier Reef from space and from the space shuttle because it's such a huge piece of functioning ecosystem that so many other forms of life are associated with them. Animals that live inside them. We can look underneath. You look at, you can see this coral has a bivalve growing out. You can see half of a shell, half of a clam. There's so many different ways organisms have found ways to be successful as an animal or a plant that we have this great diversity on reefs. That's what makes them so fascinating. There's so many different stories and so many intricate relationships that are really necessary for the whole system to really be functioning. As we lose bits and pieces of it, as we have bleached corals disappear for a while, or we eat all the fishes, the system winds down a bit, and it takes a while for it to recover. That's what we term resilience. We don't have great confidence that today's reefs in many places are going to be able to recover. because we've changed either the water conditions or the number of organisms so dramatically.
Thank you very much. We sort of mentioned dolphins a bit before, but I think someone wants to come and do some dolphin watching. Do you see dolphins out here?
They're fairly common. You have to be the right time. I was out on Friday when I was expecting I might see them. I didn't see any. And I know another colleague of mine was out looking and he didn't see any. They move around a lot. And last summer we actually did some dolphin tagging. We have an educational exhibit here called Dolphin Quest, run by some veterinarians, and they have different areas around the world where they do that. But they're very interested in looking at the common dolphin around Bermuda, the bottlenose dolphin. It seems to be the commonest one. So we went out and captured them in a very safe way. Veterinarians were doing all the work. We tagged them, and some of them just stayed around Bermuda. They just went out to offshore about 25 miles from seamounts and back to Bermuda and back and forth. But one of them took off and went about 300 miles north to some really deep seamounts and then came back. And that's what satellite tracking tools, and I know you have a section you done with Choi Ming about shark tagging, is when you get a picture of how much space these animals can use in their oceans, it just blows our minds. So just like, I can't believe they do that. But it makes perfect sense that an animal will swim to find food, and it must have left here looking for some sort of food that it wasn't getting here. So dolphins are present, but not nearly this as you would find in many parts of the world. I'm really only familiar with the eastern part of the U.S. or when I was working in the Florida Keys, where dolphins are fairly common. They're not common here, and they wouldn't come into waters like this. At least we've never seen them in here. They may come in, but we have no record of seeing them here. Yeah, great. Good question.
Yeah, I think what we're going to try and do now is switch streams. What we're going to do,
he's in charge of that.
He was in charge of it. So I'm going to start broadcasting on here, and then hopefully you can find that and then switch people over, and we can start talking a little bit about some of the little wonderful bits of life we can find here.
There's a lot of life in this stock. Jamie's had a lot of fun discovering things and learning about stuff in this area. I hope you're all discovering and learning wonderful things too with all the broadcasts we've been doing.
Sorry, I can tell you typing through a waterproof case is not that.
Well, I can distract everybody with some other discussions.
Yes, please do distract.
So I showed you a coral to begin with, and that was our hard coral. But I want to show you a different group of corals which are very common here. And let me show you a sea fan. I'm going to hold it up a little bit closer to the camera. You can see, it really does look like it's all tied together. It's actually in one plane. And this is a group of animals we call soft corals, octocorals. And the whole goal of these corals, let me just get it out here, is that they want to pick plankton out of the water. And so they rely on waves to be able to push this fan back and forth, because that's the most efficient way to capture all the particles in the water that they're after. So this is a fairly common feature. Even in the most extreme exposed reefs, these corals just can tolerate hurricane waves. They just bend. They're just so flexible. They just bend with the current, no matter how strong the storms are. I'll show you a different one here. There's another one called the sea rod. It's pretty dead. It's lost most of its coloration, but they can be pretty tall. Like some are the ones that are around this island are taller than me, of just about 2.8 meters, about 5'10" thereabouts. So just a very flexible skeleton, which is completely different than the very rigid skeletons of these corals here. How are we doing, Jamie?
I think we're on.
Oh, okay. Well, I'll pass it
So
back to Jamie.
Hopefully Ricardo will come back to those and keep those up there. But if you can find a second stream, hopefully what we can do is we can just come along here and point to. So we're going to stop this broadcast because it's going to be very difficult to have two streams going at one go. And in the chat here, somebody will put the URL of the new broadcast, I hope.